The moment Josephine Merriweather drove the last nail into her husband's grave marker, she made herself 3 promises she intended to keep, until the desert dust claimed her too. The sun had already begun its slow collapse behind the red ridges of the Nevada hills when she pressed her palm flat against the weathered wood and whispered the words aloud, because Thomas Merriweather had always said that promises made in silence had a way of dissolving in the heat. He had been a practical man, her Thomas, full of proverbs and routines and a stubbornness that she had sometimes loved and sometimes resented. And now that he was gone, she missed every last inch of it with a ferocity that surprised even her. She had buried him on the eastern edge of their property on a Wednesday morning in the spring of 1882, 3 weeks after a fever had crept into his lungs and refused to leave. The doctor from Carson City had ridden out twice, had shaken his head both times, and on the 3rd visit had come only to confirm what Josephine already knew. Thomas was 34 years old. She was 31. They had been married 9 years. Their daughter, Clara, had stood beside her mother at the grave with her small fists pressed against her black dress, and her chin lifted at that precise angle that made her look so much like her father it was almost cruel. Clara was 7, old enough to understand what a grave meant, young enough to still ask every few mornings whether Papa would be back for supper. So Josephine had made her 3 promises. The first was to keep the ranch running. Thomas had built the Merriweather spread from 40 acres of scrub into something respectable, and she was not going to let it fold because he was no longer there to carry it. She knew the cattle, knew the fences, knew the rhythm of the seasons. She would learn what she did not yet know. The second promise was to raise Clara well, to give her both the tenderness her mother could offer and the steadiness her father had modeled, to never let her daughter feel the full weight of that absence if she could help it. The third promise was to never marry again. This one she had made without grief or drama, simply as a statement of fact. Thomas had been the one. She was certain of it in the same way she was certain of the shape of the mountains and the direction the river ran. There would be no replacing him, and she had no intention of trying. She had kept all 3 promises faithfully for 2 years. Then Jonas Collier rode onto her property on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 1884 with a lame horse, a broken saddle strap, and the worst timing in the county. She was mending fence on the north pasture when she heard the horse before she saw him, an uneven clomping across the dry ground that told her immediately the animal was not well. She straightened up from the post she had been hammering, shaded her eyes with her hand, and watched the rider approach. He was tall in the saddle, even with the horse listing slightly to the right, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from actual work rather than pretension. His hat was brown and trail-worn, his coat the color of the canyon walls to the west, and he had several days of dark stubble along his jaw. He looked like a man who had been on the road a significant amount of time and had not particularly enjoyed it. He pulled the horse to a careful stop about 20 yards from her and touched the brim of his hat. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not require raising. "I apologize for the intrusion. My horse threw a shoe 2 miles back, and I believe she may have strained the leg coming over the south ridge. I saw your fence line, and I was hoping to ask whether I might borrow your corral until morning." Josephine looked at the horse. The animal's right foreleg was held slightly off the ground, and even from this distance she could see the tension in the horse's flanks that indicated real discomfort. "You'll want to get her weight off that leg," she said, already moving toward the gate. "Bring her through here, corrals around the side." He dismounted carefully, keeping the horse steady, and led her through the gate Josephine had opened. He walked with a slight deliberateness, like a man accustomed to rough terrain, and he kept one hand close to the horse's neck in that unconscious way that told her he cared about the animal genuinely rather than as a matter of property. "Thank you," he said as she latched the gate behind them. "I'm Jonas Collier. I'm riding up to Elko on a survey contract." "Josephine Merriweather," she said. "This is my ranch." He looked around at the property with an open and honest assessment, the kind that was not intrusive but simply observant, the way a person who worked land looked at other people's land. "Fine spread," he said. "It was my husband's," she said, because she always said it. She had learned that saying it clearly and early prevented a certain kind of misunderstanding. "He passed 2 years ago. It's mine now." Jonas Collier looked at her with a directness that was not rude and said, "I'm sorry for your loss," and then he said nothing further about it, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. She showed him to the corral, and he led his horse in with care, removing the saddle gently and setting it over the rail. Josephine looked at the animal's leg and asked if she might examine it. He stood back without comment while she ran her hands down the foreleg and felt the heat pooling just above the fetlock. "She's not broken," Josephine said, standing, "but you'll want to poultice this tonight and keep her still. You have any liniment in your saddlebag?" "No, ma'am." "I'll bring some out." She walked to the barn without waiting for him to thank her again, because it was simply what you did. A horse was a horse, and a horse in pain was a problem that needed solving. She collected the liniment and some cloth from the barn shelf, and when she came back, he was standing with his hand resting on the horse's neck again, speaking quietly to the animal. She could not hear the words, but the tone was the same low, even register as when he spoke to people, and somehow that told her something about his character that she filed away without thinking about it. She showed him how to apply the wrap, and he followed her instructions without protest or pride, which told her he was a practical man. "You're welcome to sleep in the barn," she said when they were done. "It's dry tonight and there's a cot near the feed room." "I'm grateful," he said, "truly." She almost said that it was nothing, but it was not nothing because she did not generally invite strangers into her barn. She had a rifle in the house and she was not incapable of protecting herself and Clara, but she had also been running this ranch for 2 years with only intermittent help from the Garber boys down the road, and she knew the difference between a man who was a threat and a man who was simply a man. Jonas Collier was simply a man. "Dinner is at 6, she said. "You're welcome to wash at the pump." Then she walked back to the house, already aware that she had just done something she had not done since Thomas died, which was extend an ordinary human hospitality to someone who was not a neighbor or a relation, and that the small act of it had not felt like betrayal. Clara was at the kitchen table doing her reading when Josephine came in, the book spread open and her finger tracking the lines with that solemn attention she brought to everything. "There's a man in the barn," Josephine said, pulling the pot forward on the stove. "His horse is lame. He'll be staying the night and taking supper with us." Clara looked up. "What kind of man?" "A survey man going to Elko." "Is he nice?" "He seems decent," Josephine said. "Set a third plate." Jonas came to dinner washed and with his hat in his hands, and he pulled his chair out carefully and waited until Clara and Josephine had sat before he sat himself. He complimented the food without being excessive about it, which Josephine thought was the correct measure. He spoke to Clara with a seriousness that treated her as a person rather than a small inconvenience, asking what she was reading and listening to her answer about the Lewis and Clark journals with genuine attention. "Did you know," Clara said to him, "that they went all the way to the ocean?" "I did know that," Jonas said. "Have you looked at the maps?" "We don't have the maps." "There are very good maps in some of the government survey offices," he said. "That's part of what I do, actually. I work with land surveys. We make maps." Clara's eyes went a little wide at this. "Could you draw one?" "Clara," Josephine said. "It's fine," Jonas said, and he asked Clara for a piece of paper and spent the better part of 10 minutes drawing her a rough but surprisingly accurate map of the Nevada Territory, marking the mountains and rivers with light, practiced lines. Clara studied it with the same serious attention she brought to her reading, and when she looked up she said, "Thank you, Mr. Collier," in a voice that carried more genuine gratitude than most adults managed. Something shifted in Josephine's chest, small and quiet, like a stone settling deeper into the ground. She pressed her hand flat on the table and looked at her plate. After Clara went to bed, Jonas helped Josephine carry the dishes to the basin without being asked. They washed up in a companionable silence that was not uncomfortable, and then he said he would head out to the barn and not take any more of her evening. "You said you survey land," she said, and she was not entirely sure why she was prolonging the conversation. "What does that take you to Elko?" "There's a railroad line being planned," he said. "They need accurate measurements of the grade through the pass. I've done 3 survey contracts this year. Before that, I had a small stake in a cattle operation over in Utah Territory, but it went under when my partner sold his share." "You know cattle," she said. "Enough to know that yours look well tended," he said. She studied him for a moment. He was not handsome in the way that made a woman feel nervous about it. He was handsome in a quieter way, the way a well-built fence was handsome, in its proportions and its solidness and the evidence of care in its construction. He had brown eyes with a kind of steadiness in them that she associated with people who had been through something difficult and had come through it without bitterness. "Good night, Mr. Collier," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Merriweather," he said, and touched his hat and went out into the dark. She stood at the window for a moment after he was gone, watching the lamp light move through the gap in the barn door as he settled in, and then she turned away and went to check on Clara. He left in the morning after checking his horse's leg, which was improved enough for careful travel, and he thanked her again with the same simple, unembellished directness he seemed to bring to everything. He paid her for the liniment and the feed without being asked, and he paid her fairly, and she did not argue because it was the right amount. She watched him ride north up the road until he was a small shape against the sage, and then she went back to her fence line. She did not think about him for 3 days, and then she thought about him, and she thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. He came back 6 weeks later on a Friday evening, riding south from Elko with his horse sound and his survey case strapped to the back of the saddle. He stopped at her gate and she was on the porch, and she noticed that she was not surprised to see him, which surprised her. "The survey is done," he said. "I'm heading south to Reno. I wanted to stop and return this." He reached into his coat and produced the cloth she had used to wrap his horse's leg, washed and folded. She looked at the cloth and then at him. "You rode back to return a piece of cloth," she said. "I rode back to return a piece of cloth," he confirmed. There was a long pause, and then she said, "You'd better come in for supper." He dismounted and tied his horse to the post and came up the porch steps, and she held the door open and he walked through, hat in hand, and Clara looked up from her map, the one he had drawn her, which she had tacked to the kitchen wall, and said, "Mr. Collier," with the kind of pleasure that a child cannot conceal. "Miss Clara," he said. Over supper he told them about the survey, about the pass through the mountains, and the way the light hit the snow on the upper ridges in the afternoon, and about a family of pronghorn he had watched for nearly an hour one evening because the light was too poor for surveying, and there was nothing else he wanted to do. "They move like they're made of water," he said. "Just flow across the ground." Josephine looked at him and thought that was a precise and beautiful way to describe a thing, and she did not say so, but she stored it away. After supper, while Clara was getting ready for bed, Jonas stood on the porch and looked out at the dark land, and Josephine stood beside him, and they were quiet together in that way that felt entirely natural and not at all like two strangers. "I know this is forward," he said at last, "and I know your situation, and I'm not asking you to think of me as anything other than what I am, which is a man who has found himself thinking about this ranch and this family considerably more than is warranted by a single night's hospitality." Josephine looked at the dark hills. "I promised myself I wouldn't marry again," she said, because she thought it was honest to say it. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to marry me. I'm asking if I might come back." She thought about Thomas. She thought about the grave marker on the east pasture and the 3 promises she had driven into the wood beside it. She thought about Clara's map on the kitchen wall and the way this man had listened to her daughter like she was worth listening to. "You might come back," she said. He came back in July. He came back in August with a crate of books from Reno, because Clara had mentioned she was running out of things to read. and he had apparently made a note of this and done something about it. Josephine stood on the porch when he unloaded the crate and watched her daughter's face go luminous with the kind of joy that needed no words, and she felt the thing in her chest that had been settling for months settle another increment deeper. He stayed 4 days in August, sleeping in the barn as before, and helping with the fencing on the west pasture without being asked, and eating supper with them every evening. He was not trying to replace Thomas. He was not trying to be anything he was not. He was simply there, steady and quiet and real, and she found that she had been lonely in a way she had not permitted herself to acknowledge, and his presence made the loneliness visible by contrast, the way a lamp makes a shadow. On his last evening he asked her to walk with him to the edge of the property where the ground dropped away, and you could see the whole valley laid out below in the copper light, and she went. They stood there for a while and the sky turned colors she could not have named, and he said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to know it's not a request. It's just something I need to say." She looked at him. "I think you are the most remarkable woman I've ever known," he said. "Not because of anything theatrical, because of the way you work and the way you love your daughter and the way you make a decision and keep it. I think you're remarkable, and I wanted you to know it." Josephine looked at the valley and breathed in the dry sage air and said, "Thomas was a good man." "I believe you," Jonas said. "He was patient and honest, and he worked harder than almost anyone I ever knew." "He sounds like a man worth keeping," Jonas said quietly. "He was," she said, "and I kept him as long as I could." She felt the tears before she was aware she was going to cry, and she pressed her fingers against her eyes with a kind of controlled impatience, because she did not cry often and she did not enjoy it. Jonas did not reach for her immediately. He waited, and then he put one hand very gently on her arm and said nothing at all, and that was exactly right. When she was done, she took a breath and looked at him and said, "I haven't told anyone that before, that I kept him as long as I could." "It's a hard thing to have to learn," he said. "You've lost someone," she said. "It was not a question." "My wife," he said. 4 years ago, childbirth, the baby too." She closed her eyes for a moment. "I'm sorry." "So am I," he said. "It's a different kind of sorry now than it was, but it's still there." They stood in the copper light and the valley darkened below them, and neither of them said anything more about it, but something had passed between them that was more substantial than words, the recognition of shared grief and the understanding that shared grief was not a weakness but a kind of common ground. He left in the morning and she watched him go again, and this time she knew she was not watching a stranger ride away. September brought the first cool air down from the mountains, and with it a letter from Jonas postmarked from Reno. 3 pages written in his careful, angular handwriting, about a contract he'd taken near Sacramento and a disagreement with a landowner who refused to accept where his property line actually fell, and a description of the Pacific coast as seen from a hill above the city that he thought she might find interesting. He said he would be back in October if she would have him. She wrote back. She wrote 2 pages, and then she wrote 3, and she described the cattle and the change in the light on the hills and a moment when Clara had read a passage from one of his books aloud at dinner, and both of them had been struck quiet by it. She said she would have him in October. Clara found the letter she had received from him on the table one afternoon and asked, "Are you friends with Mr. Collier?" "I believe so," Josephine said. "Good," Clara said simply. "He's the kind of person you should be friends with." Josephine looked at her daughter and thought that Thomas would have found this deeply, perfectly funny, and she smiled to herself in the private way she still did sometimes when Thomas found a way to be present in things. He came in October, and he brought a proper saddle blanket for her horse, which she had mentioned in passing in her letter as being worn thin, and she had not expected him to remember it, but she should have, because by now she was beginning to understand that Jonas Collier remembered things. He stayed 6 days, and on the 4th day it rained, one of those slow October rains that soaked into the ground and turned the air sweet, and they sat on the porch in the early evening and watched it come down across the pasture. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. I have been telling myself since you started coming back here that what I was doing was simply being a decent host and a reasonable friend. And, and that is not entirely accurate, she said. He was quiet for a moment, watching the rain. Then he said, "What is accurate?" She pressed her hands together in her lap. "I think about you," she said, "when you're not here. I think about what you would say about something that happened, or what you would think about a problem I'm trying to solve. I thought about you for 3 days after you first left, and then I thought that was the end of it." "It wasn't the end of it," he said. "No," she said, "it wasn't." He turned toward her, and his face in the gray rain light was serious and open, and she could see everything in it. "I've been in love with you since August," he said. "I've been trying to give you time because I didn't want to push you somewhere you didn't want to go." Josephine Merriweather, who had kept 3 promises to a dead man for 2 years and had believed she would keep them forever, sat on her porch in the October rain and felt the ground beneath her shift in the way that ground sometimes does, not collapsing but rearranging, settling into a new and more honest shape. "I promised Thomas I wouldn't marry again," she said. "I know. I believed that promise when I made it." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him. "I think I'm telling you that I'm reconsidering it, not because the promise wasn't real, but because Thomas was not a man who wanted me to be alone if there was someone worth not being alone with." "How do you know?" he asked very gently. "Because I knew him," she said. 9 years. I knew him well enough to know that he would have looked at you and liked you and then told me not to be a fool about it." Jonas Collier looked at her with those steady brown eyes and said nothing for a long moment, and then he said, "I'm not asking you to set Thomas aside. I'm not asking you to love me instead of him. I'm asking if there's room." "There's room," she said, and she was surprised by how certain it felt. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat in the rain and watched the pasture go dark and green with the water. And Clara came to the doorway in her nightgown and looked at them and went back inside without a word, which meant she approved. In November he asked her to marry him properly, with both of them standing in the kitchen after supper, and Clara already upstairs because Josephine had told her to go to bed 20 minutes ago, and she had gone without argument, which meant she knew what was coming. He said, "Josephine, I love you. I love your daughter. I love this land and what you've built here. I would like very much to build the rest of my life here with you if you'll have me. I know there are things that come before me, and that is as it should be. I'm asking you to let me stand beside them, not in front of them." She thought about the grave marker on the east pasture. She thought about the 3 promises. She thought about 9 years with Thomas and 2 years without him and 6 months with Jonas Collier moving in and out of her life like the light through the barn door. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, and she realized he had been more afraid than he had shown, which she found both endearing and entirely reasonable. They were married in December of 1884 in the small church in the nearest town, Carson Wells, with Clara standing beside her mother in a green dress. She had chosen herself and the Garber brothers as witnesses, and the Reverend who had known Thomas Merriweather and who looked at Jonas Collier with careful eyes and then, apparently finding what he was looking for, performed the ceremony with warmth and genuine blessing. It was not a large wedding, and it was not a complicated one. It was 2 people standing in a cold December church with the light coming through plain glass windows and saying that they intended to belong to each other, and meaning it. Josephine wore the same dress she had worn to every good occasion in her life for the past several years, because it was a good dress, and she was not a woman given to excess. But she did put Clara's winter wildflowers in her hair, small yellow things Clara had dried in the fall against exactly this purpose. And Jonas looked at them and looked at her, and something in his face opened up like a room that had been closed for a long time. After the ceremony, standing outside in the cold with the sky very blue and very wide above them, Clara slipped her hand into Jonas's and said, "I'm going to keep calling you Mr. Collier for a while." "That's perfectly fine," he said. "But maybe eventually I'll change it," she said. "That's fine too," he said. She considered this seriously and then nodded, as though terms had been negotiated and found acceptable, and walked ahead of them to where the Garber brothers were waiting. And Jonas looked at Josephine, and there it was again, that quiet, warm thing behind his eyes that was the closest she had ever seen humor and love occupy the same expression. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon, and the cold air smelled of juniper and distant snow, and Jonas took the reins and Josephine sat beside him with Clara leaning against her shoulder, and the horses moved steadily through the desert afternoon, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was happy. It was not the same happiness as the happiness she had had with Thomas. It was not trying to be. It was its own thing, differently shaped, arrived at differently, made from different materials and different years. It was real and it was hers, and she held it without apology. That first winter together was the season when Josephine learned the particular and practical pleasure of not being alone in a problem. The winter of 1884 was a hard one, colder than the two before it, and in January a portion of the north fence came down in a wind storm and 14 head of cattle drifted 3 miles before they found them, and Jonas was out in the dark and the cold with her, both of them bundled in every piece of clothing they owned, working by lantern light to turn the herd back toward home. He did not complain. She did not expect him to, but she noticed it anyway, the absence of complaint in hard circumstances, because it was not nothing. He was steady in the cold the way he was steady in everything, not performing steadiness but simply possessing it as a quality of character. They got the cattle home at 2 in the morning, and he rebuilt the fence section the next day while she rested, which she had not asked him to do but which she also did not refuse, because she was tired, and it was a sensible division, and she was learning slowly that accepting help was not the same as weakness. Clara went from calling him Mr. Collier to calling him Mr. Jonas sometime around February, and Josephine could see Jonas trying not to react to this, trying to keep his face ordinary, and failing just slightly in the way that meant the most. By spring, Josephine knew that the 3 promises she had made at Thomas's grave needed to be visited, not broken, not abandoned, reconsidered, the way a surveyor might revisit a measurement, not because the first one was careless, but because the land itself had changed. She went to the grave on a Tuesday morning in March when the air was still cool, and the new grass was just beginning to show in the low places. She knelt beside the marker and she put her hand on the wood, and she talked to Thomas the way she had sometimes talked to him when he was alive, plainly and without ceremony. She told him about Jonas. She told him about the books and the maps and the way Jonas listened to Clara. She told him about the fence in the winter storm and about the way Jonas said her name in the morning, with a simplicity that was different from the way Thomas had said it but no less true. She told him that she had not replaced him, could not replace him, would not. She told him that she had simply found that the heart was larger than she had believed and that she was grateful for it. Then she told him that she was going to amend the 3rd promise, not break it, amend it. She was going to say that the promise had been kept in the spirit in which it was made, which was that she would not marry carelessly or out of loneliness or need, and she had not. She had waited until there was something real, and she believed Thomas would recognize the difference. She stayed at the grave for a while after that, not saying anything, just being there, and then she got up and went back to the house, and Jonas was in the kitchen with Clara teaching her the principles of reading a compass, and Josephine stood in the doorway and watched them and felt the grief and the love occupy the same space in her chest, not canceling each other out but coexisting, the way the desert holds both heat and cold, depending on the hour. "Come in," Jonas said without looking up. "She's getting it. She's got a better sense of direction than most survey crews I've worked with." "I found north," Clara said proudly. "You certainly did," Josephine said, and came in and sat down at the table with them. Spring moved into summer, and Jonas took a short survey contract in May but was back by June, and he brought Josephine a small piece of rose quartz he had found in the survey area, smooth and pink and warm, from his pocket. "I don't know why I thought of you," he said. "I just did." She turned the stone in her fingers and looked at him and said, "Thank you," and meant it the way people mean things that are small and enormous at the same time. He began to take on more of the ranch work that summer, not displacing what she had built but joining it, adding his own competence to hers in a way that doubled their capacity without diminishing either of them. He was good with the horses, better than she had expected, with a patience and lightness of touch that the animals responded to with an ease that she found satisfying to watch. He had a dispute with a neighboring landowner in August, a man named Harlan Burt, who claimed that the creek on the western edge of the Merriweather property actually ran through land that was his under a deed from 1876. Harlan Burt was a loud and self-important man who had ridden over 3 times that year to make the claim in progressively more aggressive terms. On his 4th visit, he arrived with 2 of his hired hands and a document he said proved his claim, and he made clear that he considered the matter settled in his favor. Jonas came out to the yard where Burt had stopped his horse and looked up at the man with that complete and settled stillness he possessed and said, "I'm a land surveyor, Mr. Burt. I have been for 8 years. I've surveyed 3 territories and a good portion of this county. Would you like me to pull out the actual deed records and the survey maps and we can have a look at exactly where that creek runs?" Harlan Burt blustered for a moment. "Because I can do that," Jonas said in the same calm, level tone. "I have the county survey records. It'll take me about an hour to show you precisely why your claim is incorrect." Burt looked at his hired men. They looked at the ground. "I'll have my lawyer review it," Burt said finally. "That's a fine idea," Jonas said. "Have him come and see the survey maps. I'll be here." Burt rode away and did not come back, and 2 months later Josephine received a letter from the county land office confirming that the creek fell within the Merriweather property boundaries, as originally recorded in 1878. She put the letter in the tin box where she kept important papers, and felt a satisfaction that was partly about the creek, and partly about watching Jonas Collier face down a bullying man with nothing but accuracy and composure and win. She told him so that night. He looked mildly amused. "He had a bad deed and a worse temper," he said. "That's not a combination that holds up." "Still," she said. He looked at her. "Still, I was proud of you," she said. "Is that a strange thing to say?" He shook his head. "No," he said. "It's not a strange thing. I liked hearing it." She reached across the table and put her hand on his, and they sat like that for a moment in the evening quiet of the kitchen. By the end of that summer, Clara had started calling him Papa Jonas, not all the time, but occasionally in the natural way that children sometimes arrive at things without fanfare. The first time she said it, Jonas went very still for a moment, and then he said, "Yes," in a voice that was almost entirely steady, and Clara asked her question and Jonas answered it, and neither of them made any particular ceremony of what had just happened. But Josephine, who had been standing at the stove with her back to the room, had to close her eyes and breathe carefully for a moment. She did not tell Jonas she had heard. She did not need to. That night she lay beside him in the dark, listening to the coyotes far off in the hills, and she said, "You're good with her." "She makes it easy," he said. "It's not just that," Josephine said. "You're genuinely good with her. It's a real thing." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "She's a remarkable child." "She is," Josephine said. "She's Thomas's child in the ways that matter and her own child in all the other ways. I want you to know I see you with her and I don't take it for granted." He turned toward her in the dark and said, "I don't feel like it requires thanks." "I know," she said. "I'm not thanking you. I'm just telling you that I see it." He put his hand against her face and she turned into it, and they lay in the desert dark with the coyotes singing their distant songs and the ranch quiet around them. And Josephine thought that this was what it meant to build a life, not the grand gestures but the accumulation of small, true moments, layered like soil over years, until they became the ground you stood on. The news came in October that year that Josephine was expecting a child. She told Jonas on a Friday morning before Clara was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she told him plainly the way she did things, watching his face. He did not say anything for a long moment. She could see him working through the history of it, the child he had lost 4 years before with his first wife, the weight of that loss and the weight of this news pressing against each other. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm more than all right," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, but his eyes were those steady brown eyes. "I'm terrified," he said, "and I'm more than all right." "That seems like a reasonable combination," she said. He stood up and came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took both her hands and looked at her with everything in his face, the fear and the love and the grief and the gratitude and the hope, all of it visible, nothing held back. "I'll be here," he said, "every day of this, whatever it needs." "I know," she said. "I'm not worried." "You're not worried about anything," he said, and there was wonder in it rather than critique. "I'm worried about the north fence," she said. "I'm worried about the winter hay supply. I'm worried about whether Clara is getting enough reading variety. I'm not worried about you." He smiled at that, a real smile, one of those smiles that changed his whole face, and he pressed his forehead briefly against her hands, and she felt the weight of his relief and his love and his intention all at once. Clara took the news with the considered gravity that was her standard approach to significant information, sat with it for a day, and then came to Josephine and said, "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" "We don't know yet," Josephine said. "I prefer a brother," Clara said. "I'll see what I can do," Josephine said. Clara considered this. "I know that's not actually how it works," she said. "Very sensible of you," Josephine said. "But I still prefer a brother," Clara said, and went back to her book. The winter of 1885 was easier than the winter before it, or perhaps it was easier because there were two of them facing it now rather than one. Josephine's pregnancy was uncomplicated in its first months, a thing she was grateful for with a gratitude that was not abstract but specific and physical, grounded in what she knew of how these things could go. She continued working the ranch through the winter, sensibly and without excess, and Jonas worked beside her and around her with a care that was not overbearing, because he knew her well enough to understand that overprotection was its own kind of disrespect. He watched her carefully, and she let him, and neither of them made it a production. He wrote his survey company to reduce his contract work through the spring, explaining his circumstances, and the company's response was understanding if slightly disappointed, and he put the letter away and did not mention it again as a sacrifice. It was a choice. He had made it without drama. In the evenings he and Clara read together, and the sound of their voices came through to wherever Josephine was, the rise and fall of a story being told, and a child asking questions, and she would stop what she was doing sometimes just to listen to it. She received a letter from Thomas's sister in February, from Virginia where the family had originally come from, and the sister wrote that she had heard Josephine had remarried and hoped she was well, and hoped the man was kind. Josephine wrote back and said yes, and described Jonas in 3 careful paragraphs, and sent Clara's love, and folded the letter and felt that particular satisfaction of things being properly accounted for. Jonas's survey colleague, a man named Abe Larkin who had worked with him on the Sacramento contract, came through Carson Wells in February on his way to a survey in Utah Territory and stopped at the ranch for 2 days. He was a lean, weathered man in his early 40s with a dry humor and an easy manner, and he and Jonas fell immediately into the comfortable conversation of men who have worked together in difficult conditions and trust each other. Josephine liked him. She could see in how he spoke to Jonas what kind of man Jonas was among other men, the same as the man he was at home, no performance and no shift in character, and she found that this told her something important and welcome. Abe Larkin sat at their dinner table and ate her food and complimented it honestly, and then looked around the kitchen with its maps and books and Clara's drawings tacked to the wall and said, "I'll tell you, Jonas, this is about as good as I've seen a man situated." "I know it," Jonas said simply. Abe looked at Josephine. "He's been different since he met you," he said. "I don't mean different bad. I mean different, like a man who has found the thing he was looking for and stopped having to look. Josephine looked at her coffee. I hope he's found it, she said. He has, Abe said. Trust me, I've known him 7 years. The man has found it. After Abe left, Jonas said to her, I hope that wasn't too forward. It was entirely appropriate, she said. I liked hearing it. He looked at her. You said that before, that you liked hearing a thing. I suppose I did. You're not generally someone who asks for reassurance, he said. No, she said, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate it when it arrives on its own. He nodded and filed it away because that was what he did with things about her, and she had come to understand that he kept them the way she kept her important papers, carefully, and in a place he could find them again. March brought the thaw, and with it the business of spring preparation, the inventory of fences, and the planning of grazing rotation, and the hiring of an extra hand for the calving season. They hired a young man named Pete Dawson from Carson Wells, 17, large for his age and earnest, who worked hard and learned quickly and treated Josephine with a respectful courtesy that told her he had been raised right. Pete called her Mrs. Collier without hesitation, which was the first time she had heard herself called that in anything other than an official context, and she found she did not mind it at all. She had been Josephine Merriweather for so long. She was still Josephine. The name she carried was simply carrying more now, the way land carries more when you've worked it well. April arrived, and with it the intensification of her pregnancy, the growing weight and the occasional discomfort, and the small daily negotiations of a body engaged in something enormous. She did not complain. She did not have a disposition for complaining, and she did not believe in it as a general practice. But she accepted Jonas's help at the end of the day when the ache in her back was real, and she let him bring her water and sat while he stood to clear the table. And she was grateful in the quiet way she was grateful for most things. One evening in late April she was sitting on the porch watching the stars come out, and Jonas sat beside her, and they were quiet for a long time, and then she said, "Tell me something about your wife, the one you lost." He was still for a moment, and she could feel him deciding whether to tell her that she did not need to ask or whether to simply answer the question. He answered the question. Her name was Mary, he said. She was from Ohio. She came west with her family when she was 16, and we met when she was 19, at a land claims office of all places. She was there with her father, and she was reading the posted survey maps, and she had very specific opinions about where the county roads should run. Josephine smiled. That sounds like the right kind of person to meet in a land claims office. She was extraordinary, he said, funny and fierce. She would have had things to say about most of the men we encounter out here. The Harlan Burts of the world, Josephine said. Every single one, he said. They sat with Mary's memory between them, not as a threat or a competition, but as a person who had been real and was still real in the way the dead are real to those who loved them, present in a different register. Do you think about her? Josephine asked. Yes, he said. Not every day the way I used to, but yes. Good, she said. He looked at her. I would think less of you if you didn't, she said. She was yours and you were hers, and that doesn't disappear. It shouldn't. He took her hand. You are a very unusual woman, Josephine Collier. Merriweather, she said, and then Collier. She tried the combination. Both, I think. Both, he agreed. The baby came in June of 1885, on a clear morning with the desert smell of sage through the open window, and it was a boy, exactly as Clara had expressed a preference for, and she stood in the doorway of the bedroom when Jonas brought her in to see, and she looked at the red, fierce, scrunched face of her new brother and said, with considerable satisfaction, I knew it. They named him Thomas Jonas Collier. When Josephine told Jonas the name she had decided on, he looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, Are you sure? Completely, she said. The Thomas first, he said. The Thomas first, she said. He was here before both of us. Jonas pressed his lips together and nodded once, and she knew what was happening behind his face, and she let it happen. Clara announced to the Garber brothers that the baby was named Thomas, but that she was going to call him Tom, which was more practical. And this stuck immediately among everyone in the household. And within 3 weeks, Tom Collier was a fully established person in the world with a name that everyone used and strong opinions about being put down, which he expressed at considerable volume and with total commitment. Josephine healed well from the birth, in the practical and determined way she healed from everything, and by August she was back to full capacity on the ranch, which Jonas had held together with Pete Dawson's help during her recovery, and she returned to the work with a pleasure that surprised even herself, the physical satisfaction of the land under her hands again, the cattle in the pasture, the fence lined straight and true. Jonas watched her with an affection she could feel even with her back turned. She did not mind being watched by him. She had minded it once in the early days, when being watched had felt like an intrusion on the privacy of her competence. Now it felt like being known, which was a different thing entirely. That fall they made decisions together about the ranch that Josephine had been making alone for 2 years, and the making of decisions together was something she had not expected to find so genuinely pleasurable. Not because she had not been capable of making them alone, but because two perspectives on a problem found dimensions that one perspective alone could not. They decided to increase the herd by 30 head, which Jonas had researched carefully, and which she had agreed to after her own calculations confirmed his. They decided to repair and expand the barn, a project Jonas designed and Pete Dawson helped build over the course of October and November. They decided that Clara should be enrolled in the school in Carson Wells in the spring, which Clara received with the mixed feelings of someone who loved learning and was not yet certain about other children. "You'll be fine," Jonas told her. "You're the best read person in that school already, I'd wager." "What if I don't like it?" Clara asked. "Then we'll talk about it," he said, "but try it first." She tried it first. She liked it well enough, and formed a particular friendship with the school teacher, a Miss Addison who was 23 and had come from Illinois to teach, and had strong opinions about literature, which meant that she and Clara recognized each other immediately as people who agreed about what mattered. Miss Addison came to Sunday dinner twice that fall and complimented Josephine's apple pie and told Jonas that Clara had a genuine analytical mind, which he reported to Josephine afterward with a quiet pride that was entirely transparent. "You're proud," she said. "She's an extraordinary child," he said. "I know," Josephine said. "I made her." He laughed, a real laugh, the kind she still found slightly startling because it was full and warm and it changed his whole face, and she thought she would never completely stop being pleased by it. Tom Collier grew into his name with some speed, becoming at 6 months a person of decided opinions and considerable charm, and at 8 months the kind of person who pulled himself upright against anything that would hold his weight and looked around with an expression of intense satisfaction at his own achievement. Clara was an excellent elder sister, serious and attentive and not above occasional bossiness, and Tom received her bossiness with the equanimity of someone who had decided that being bossed by Clara was simply one of the features of his world. The winter of 1885 into 1886 was cold and required work, and Josephine was glad of it. She had found, since Tom's birth, that she needed to be moving, needed to feel the work of the ranch in her hands and her legs, needed the physical reality of the land as a counterbalance to the absorbing and demanding softness of caring for a very small person. Jonas understood this about her without needing to be told. He took Tom in the morning so she could go out early, and he handed him off again in the afternoons when she came back, and they managed the exchange with the easy practicality of two people who have organized themselves around something they both love. Josephine went to Thomas's grave on the anniversary of his death in February, as she had done every year. She brought Clara, who was old enough now to stand quietly and remember with her, and she told Thomas about Tom, about the name, about the life that the ranch had become. Clara put a small bunch of dried flowers at the base of the marker, the same kind she had put in her mother's hair at the wedding, and said, "Hi, Papa," in a quiet voice that was her own and private, and Josephine did not interfere with it. On the walk back to the house, Clara said, "Papa Jonas knows about Papa Thomas, doesn't he?" "He does," Josephine said. "Does it make him sad?" Josephine considered this carefully. "I think it makes him thoughtful," she said. "I think he understands that loving someone who has passed doesn't stop, and he doesn't want it to stop. He thinks your father was someone worth loving." Clara walked beside her in the winter cold and then said, "I think Papa Thomas would have liked Papa Jonas." "I do too," Josephine said. "Because they're the same kind," Clara said. "What kind is that?" Josephine asked. "The kind that does what they say," Clara said. "The kind that means it." Josephine put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and pulled her close, and they walked back through the sage toward the house, where a lamp was lit in the kitchen window. And Tom was probably pulling himself upright against the chair legs, and Jonas was probably watching him with that particular expression of complete, uncomplicated joy that Josephine had come to look for in him, the way you look for the light through the barn door. Spring 1886 brought new contracts for Jonas in the region, survey work that did not require long absence. A road planning survey along the eastern county edge that had him out 2 or 3 days at a stretch and back home by the weekend. The work was good, and he was good at it, and Josephine could see in him the satisfaction of a man who is using his capabilities fully. She had begun to teach herself to keep better accounts of the ranch finances that spring, sitting in the evenings with the ledger and Jonas across the table with his survey logs. And they worked in the comfortable parallel silence of two people, each engaged in their own work, but aware of the other. And occasionally one would look up with a question or a thought, and the other would answer, and they would go back to their work. And it was an ordinary kind of pleasure that Josephine had come to love, with the same depth she loved the less ordinary kinds. The Garber brothers from down the road came by in April with news that one of the Garber daughters was to be married in May, and they were invited, all of them, to the wedding. And Jonas drove them all into Carson Wells in the wagon, and they sat in the church where he and Josephine had married and watched young Emily Garber say her vows with the absolute certainty of a 19-year-old girl entirely in love, and it was a perfectly beautiful thing. At the reception afterward, Jonas danced with Josephine on the rough wooden floor of the Garber's barn, the fiddle player sawing through a slow song with more enthusiasm than precision, and she put her hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat, and thought that a thing you had not expected could become the most expected thing in the world, the thing you could not now imagine doing without. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "I'm thinking about how the first time I saw you I thought you were simply a man with a lame horse," she said. "And now I know you're a man with an excellent sense of direction," she said. He smiled and turned her through the dance, and the fiddle picked up, and Clara was across the room dancing with the Garber boy, who was her age with the profound self-consciousness of a 9-year-old at a celebration, and Jonas's sister, who had come from Salt Lake City for the wedding because Jonas had invited her, was holding Tom and swaying him to the music with an ease that told Josephine she would make a good aunt. His sister was named Ruth, and she was 35, a school teacher with dark eyes and Jonas's same quality of paying attention to things. She had come to the ranch the day before the wedding and spent the evening in the kitchen with Josephine, the two of them talking with the ease of women who recognize in each other a certain kind of directness. Ruth had said, "He wrote me about you before he came back the second time. He wrote me that he had met a woman who ran a cattle ranch alone and mended her own fences and wasn't impressed by him, and that this was the most compelling thing that had happened to him in 4 years." "I was perfectly civil," Josephine said. "Oh, I know," Ruth said. "He didn't mean it as a criticism, he meant it as the opposite." Josephine looked at her. "He told me about Mary." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "She was something," she said, "and so are you, different somethings but real ones." "Thank you," Josephine said. "Take care of him," Ruth said. Not because he needs it in the obvious way, he doesn't, but because he's better when someone's paying attention. I've noticed, Josephine said. Ruth smiled. Good. After the wedding dance, Jonas held Tom in the wagon on the drive home, the baby asleep against his chest, with that absolute infant confidence that the person holding you is entirely reliable. And Clara had fallen asleep against Josephine's side, and the desert night was immense and clear above them. And the horse moved steadily through the dark, and Josephine took the reins in her hands and felt the night air on her face, and was so far inside her happiness that she could not see the edges of it. Jonas, she said. Yes, he said, quiet so as not to wake Tom. I want to tell you something. All right. I made 3 promises when Thomas died, she said. I promised to keep the ranch running. I promised to raise Clara well. I promised not to marry again. She could feel him listening. I kept all 3, she said. And then you came along and I had to reconsider the 3rd one, and I did, and I think it was right. I believe it was, he said softly. But I want to make a 4th promise, she said. He waited. I promise to love you, she said. Not instead of what came before, not in replacement of anything, just its own thing, just mine, just yours. I promise to love you for as long as I have. The horse moved through the dark, and Tom breathed against Jonas's chest, and Clara was warm and heavy against her side, and Jonas said nothing for a moment, and then he said, Josephine. Yes, I promise the same, he said. Every word of it. They drove home through the Nevada night with the stars overhead in their fixed and ancient patterns, and the ranch waited for them in the dark. The horses in the corral and the lamp left burning in the window and the east pasture where Thomas Merriweather's grave marker stood quiet in the night grass. And Josephine thought that life was capable of more than you planned for it, and that this was not a tragedy but a grace. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not without difficulty or sorrow or the ordinary accumulations of hard work, but full in the fundamental sense, dense with the substance of real living. Tom walked at 11 months and talked early and with enthusiasm, and by the time he was 3, he was following Jonas around the ranch with the kind of devoted attention that made Jonas's face do things it could not control. He called the horse by name before he could manage most other proper nouns. He had Thomas Merriweather's dark eyes and Jonas Collier's steadiness and Josephine's absolute stubbornness, which meant he was going to be a considerable person. Clara bloomed in school, and Miss Addison recommended her for advanced reading materials from the county library in Reno, and Clara read everything she was sent with the ferocious appetite she brought to everything she loved. She talked about becoming a teacher herself, or possibly a cartographer, the second of which she credited directly to Jonas and his survey maps. You could do both, Jonas told her. At the same time, she asked. A cartographer who teaches seems like a perfectly reasonable ambition, he said. She considered this with her characteristic seriousness and decided it was acceptable and went back to her books. Jonas's survey work expanded steadily through the late 1880s as the railroad network grew, and the territory required more precise mapping, and he hired 2 assistants and began to run a small but legitimate survey operation out of Carson Wells while also maintaining the ranch. He was often home by evening even on working days, and when he was not, Josephine managed the ranch with Pete Dawson, who had grown from a 17-year-old extra hand into a reliable young man of 20, with plans to eventually take on his own property. Josephine respected Pete Dawson's ambition and helped him think through the practicalities of it, and Jonas promised to do a proper survey of whatever land he staked when the time came, and Pete accepted this with the genuine gratitude of someone who knew it was a real promise and not a courtesy. In 1888, Josephine found herself expecting again. She told Jonas at the kitchen table, same as before, same coffee, different morning, and he looked at her the same way, with the fear and the love and the gratitude and the hope, except this time the fear was smaller and the rest of it larger, because some things you grow into with practice. Another Thomas Jonas, he said. "I was thinking," she said, "that we might try Ruth this time if it's a girl." He went very still for a moment and then he said, "My sister will be insufferable." "Your sister deserves to be insufferable," Josephine said. "She absolutely does," he said. "Yes, Ruth." It was a girl. Ruth Adelaide Collier arrived in April of 1888, named for Jonas's sister and for Josephine's grandmother, and she was small and dark-haired and furiously alive. And Tom, who was nearly 3, sat beside his mother's bed and looked at his new sister with an expression of profound suspicion that eventually, over the following weeks, converted to a possessive love so fierce it occasionally caused problems. Jonas wrote to his sister Ruth, and the reply came back with such exuberance that Josephine could feel it through the paper, and Ruth appeared at the ranch 6 weeks later from Salt Lake City, having arranged her school schedule around it, and held the baby with a tenderness so complete it made something ache pleasantly in Josephine's chest. "She looks like you," Ruth said to Jonas. "She looks like Josephine," Jonas said. "She looks like herself," Josephine said from the bed where she was being sensible about resting. They all looked at the baby, who looked back at them with the alert and ancient attention of the very newly born, as if she had been here before and was simply reorienting. By 1889, the ranch had become something Thomas Merriweather would have recognized as his own work continued, and something he would not have expected, larger and more layered, with Jonas's survey office operating from a building in Carson Wells and Josephine's cattle operation, one of the better regarded in the county, and Clara 9 years old, and a person of such clear and interesting intelligence that the county school had formally written to suggest she was ready for more than they could offer. Josephine discussed it with Jonas over 3 evenings, and they decided together to write to the secondary school in Reno, which accepted Clara with a promptness that said something about the quality of her application. Clara went to Reno in the fall of 1889 and lived with a respectable family Jonas knew from his survey work, and came home on school holidays and wrote letters that were long and detailed, and full of the kind of observations that made you feel you were standing beside her in whatever she was describing. She was happy. Josephine knew it from every letter even before Clara said so explicitly. The 3 promises lived in Josephine now as finished things, completed not abandoned, held the way you hold a finished work, with satisfaction and without the ongoing tension of something still being done. She had kept the ranch. She had raised Clara, and the 3rd promise had not been broken but renegotiated, honestly and with full attention to what it had meant and what it still meant. Thomas Merriweather's grave marker stood on the east pasture, and she kept it oiled and sound, and she visited it still, sometimes alone and sometimes with the children, and she talked to Thomas about the children, all 3 of them, and about the ranch and about Jonas, and she believed in the specific way she believed in the things that mattered most, that Thomas knew all of it and that he was entirely satisfied. She told Jonas about these visits, all of them. He listened. "Do you think he knows?" Jonas asked once. "I think he knows everything about this ranch," she said. "He built it. You don't stop knowing a thing you built." Jonas looked at the pasture where the marker stood. "I hope he knows I'm taking care of it," he said. "I think he knows," she said. "I tell him." Jonas looked at her then with that open, unguarded look she had first seen on the porch in the October rain, the look of a man with nothing he needed to conceal, and he said, "Thank you. For telling him, he said. "For not making me separate from that, for making me part of it." "You are part of it," she said. "You've been part of it since you rode in with that lame horse." He laughed his real laugh, and the sound of it went out across the pasture in the afternoon air, and the cattle lifted their heads briefly and then went back to grazing, unbothered, as cattle are, by the happiness of the people who tend them. In the summer of 1890, Josephine was 39 years old. Jonas was 42. Tom was 5 and relentlessly energetic, and had recently discovered that he was very good at roping, a skill that Pete Dawson had been teaching him with the patient dedication of a young man who believed in imparting what he knew. Ruth was 2, and had opinions about everything with a specificity and volume that the entire household found both exhausting and extremely entertaining. Clara came home from Reno for the summer, and the house was full in the way it was only when she was home, full of conversation at a higher register, of questions and books spread open on every surface and discussions at the dinner table that went on past the time the food had been finished. One evening in late June they were all on the porch after supper, the desert summer light holding long and golden past 8 o'clock, Tom on the steps with a piece of rope, Ruth in Jonas's lap with her thumb in her mouth, in defiance of all efforts to discourage the habit, Clara beside Josephine with a book closed on her knee, because the light was too beautiful to read through, and Jonas was talking quietly to Clara about what she planned to study next year. And Josephine sat in her chair with the warm evening on her face and listened. She listened to her children and her husband in the golden light and the ranch spread out before her, the cattle dark shapes in the pasture, the corral and the barn and the fences Jonas had helped her build and the house they had made together, and she thought about the first promise and the second promise and the third and the fourth. She had kept them all, every one. She had kept the ranch and raised her daughter and honored the dead and chosen the living. And here they all were together on a porch in the Nevada summer in the last light of a day that had been, like most of her days now, full of ordinary goodness. Clara said something to Jonas about cartography, and he said something back and Ruth shifted in his lap and made a small sound of protest and Tom said, "Watch this," to no one in particular, and attempted a complicated rope throw that did not succeed but which he immediately set about correcting, and Josephine put her head back and looked at the sky and felt the whole enormous ordinariness of it like a hand pressed flat against her chest. "Josephine," Jonas said. She turned her head and looked at him across the porch. He was looking at her with those steady brown eyes, and Ruth was asleep against his chest, and Clara was smiling at something Tom had just done. "Yes," she said. He did not say anything else. He just looked at her with everything in his face the way he had been looking at her for 6 years now, nothing hidden, nothing held back, the whole of what he felt for her available to anyone who cared to look. She looked back at him in the same way. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. They sat on their porch in the evening light, and the Nevada desert went on forever in every direction, and Thomas Merriweather's grave marker stood quiet on the east pasture, and the fourth promise lived in the air between them, kept and real and ongoing, a promise made to the living by a woman who had believed she was done with such promises and had been proven beautifully, completely wrong. The years came after that with the reliability of good seasons, each one bringing its own particular character, its own small crises and pleasures, its own increments of growth and change. Tom turned 7 and then 8 and attended the Carson Wells School and came home every afternoon full of news and argument, with Jonas's thoughtfulness and Josephine's stubbornness pressed together into a boy who was going to require and repay every bit of attention they had to give him. Ruth stopped with the thumb and replaced the habit with an interest in animals that kept the barn perpetually inhabited with things that had been found injured and brought home, a succession of birds and rabbits, and one memorable possum that divided the household into those who thought it was charming and those who did not. Josephine was in the did not camp, which Jonas pointed out was inconsistent with her general compassion. "I have compassion for the possum," she said. "I would like my compassion to be exercised at a distance." The possum was eventually returned to the south pasture, and Ruth was grieved for 2 days and then found a bird with a damaged wing, and the cycle began again. Pete Dawson took on his own property in 1891, 40 acres north of the Merriweather Ranch, and Jonas surveyed it properly and filed the paperwork, and Pete shook Jonas's hand with the grip of a young man who knew what a real favor looked like and intended to remember it. He came back to help with the Merriweather cattle in his spare time for the first 2 years, and then gradually his own operation took all his time, and he and Jonas occasionally crossed paths at the land office in Carson Wells and stood and talked about the county the way men talk about a place they have both committed to. Clara came home from Reno in 1892 with a teaching certificate and a plan to teach in Carson Wells, which she did, at the same school where she had studied and where Miss Addison was now principal, and the two of them worked together with the cooperative intensity of people who agree about what matters. She was 19 and she was remarkable, and Josephine watched her daughter stand at the front of a classroom in the fall of 1892 and felt Thomas Merriweather so specifically present beside her that she had to close her eyes for a moment. She told Jonas about it that evening. He said, "I felt him too when she walked up there." Josephine looked at him. "You did. In the way that things remind you of other things," he said. She stood the way you said he stood, with her chin like that. "Like that," Josephine agreed. "He's in her," Jonas said, "and he's well placed." That was the precise and right thing to say, and she loved him for it with the clean and specific love she had for him when he got things exactly right, which was frequently. The Merriweather Collier Ranch, as the county land records had it, continued to grow through the early 1890s in the slow and genuine way of things that are built carefully and maintained well. The cattle operation was sound. The fences were good. The house had been added onto twice, once for a proper study when Jonas's survey work required it, and once for a larger kitchen because Josephine had wanted it, and Jonas had made both arguments to the builder with equal conviction. Jonas's survey firm employed 3 men by 1893 and had a formal office in Carson Wells with his name on the door, and he was known in the county as the man to call for accurate work, which was the reputation he had wanted and the one he deserved. They had been married 9 years. On the evening of their 9th anniversary, Josephine thought about this. The particular fact of 9 years with Jonas Collier matching the 9 years she had had with Thomas Merriweather. And she did not find it a sorrowful comparison, but an interesting one. The way 2 rivers of different character can both be full and real and worth crossing. She was not the same woman she had been at 31, kneeling at a grave marker in the April dust, making promises to a dead man. She was harder and softer simultaneously, tempered by what she had lost and opened by what she had found, carrying grief and love in the same hands with the practiced ease of someone who has long since learned that they are not opposites. She was 40 and she was healthy and she ran a good ranch, and she had 3 children and a husband who looked at her across rooms with everything visible in his face. And she was the woman who had kept 4 promises, 3 to the dead and 1 to the living, and every one of them had made her more completely herself. That evening Jonas came to find her at Thomas's grave marker, where she had gone alone in the last light of the day, and he stood beside her without being asked, and they were quiet together on the east pasture with the first stars appearing over the hills. 9 years, she said. 9 years, he said. He and I had 9 years, she said. I know, he said. She looked at the marker and then at the stars and then at Jonas beside her in the falling dark. I intend to have considerably more than 9 with you, she said. He looked at her with those steady brown eyes. Good, he said. That's my intention too. She took his hand, there on the east pasture beside the grave of the man she had loved first, and he held it, and they stood together in the dark until the stars were fully out and the coyotes started their distant singing, and the lamp in the kitchen window was yellow and warm, and through the glass they could see the shape of Clara moving, probably putting Tom and Ruth to bed with her particular brand of decisive tenderness. Everything was as it should be. Not perfect because nothing was, but true and whole and built to last. They walked back to the house together through the sage-scented dark, and Jonas held the door for her, and she went in, and the kitchen was warm and the children were loud and the fire was good, and Josephine Merriweather Collier set her hand on her husband's chest and felt his heartbeat and was home in every sense of the word, deeply and permanently, and without reservation home.